we're up to week 4, and it's Manichaeanism, Neoplatonism, and Hermeticism. When we ended with the more extreme uh, forms of Gnosticism last week, I got emails from a number of people saying everything they they thought it was Star Wars screenwriters that were at work to God knows what. Uh, it's not going to let up at all this week, I'm afraid. We're still going to see interesting things. Anyhow, to begin, Mani, who I call the ultimate syncretist here, was a historic figure. Uh, Interestingly enough, we know more about documentably about his life than probably we do of Jesus Christ. But he lived in the 3rd century CE, Common Era, uh, and he lived for the most part, in Persia, the Sassanid Persian Empire, which was um, this, as I mentioned in this little aside in the middle of the slide, it was the major rival to the late Roman Empire and the early Byzantine Empire, and it didn't collapse really until the rise of Islam from the Arab lands to the southwest. Uh, it was polyglot, by which I mean you could have found any of 15 or 20 languages spoken, including languages that were in Palestine and in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Mani, the historical figure Mani, would have been exposed because of this polyglot empire to influences from everywhere to the east in Asia, including China and including India, because if you look at that map closely, you will see that there are elements of India in the southeast that were dominated by the Persian Sassanid rulers in the 3rd century, all the way to the 5th and 6th centuries, actually. So he was born in this polyglot universe into a family that spoke Aramaic, which is important because it's the language of the newly arisen Christian tradition, as well as Greek to the West. And of course, it's the Jewish language, the Judaic language of the period. Uh, and, and the Christian sects that had moved east from Palestine into Persia were either Aramaic speaking or Syriac, Old Syriac speakers, which was an Aramaic offshoot. So he would have been familiar with various dialects of those languages. His family was from a sect of Jewish Christian Gnostics. And so he was exposed where he lived to the entire gamut of regional traditions, mystery cults, Platonism, Judaism, Christianity, Gnosticism, Zoroastrianism, the native Persian religion, Mandaism, which we talked about a bit a couple sessions ago, that Jewish baptismal cult that lived into the 21st century, Buddhism, and even Jainism, the Jains of India. Uh, and he incorporates, as we'll see, elements of everything. Everything becomes grist for the mill. His father was something of a religious monk, a seeker, someone who was interested in truth seeking. And legend says that his father heard a voice urging him into an ascetic life, to abstain from meat, wine, and women. In obedience to this call, according to the legend, he migrates south from where he was born around Ctesiphon, and with his son, and joined the Mandean sect, which is itself, as I point out, a kind of syncretic sect that includes elements of all sorts of other things. As an adolescent, Mani received revelations. He has visions that indicated the validity of all major religious systems, but their incompleteness. So the message he receives is there's truth in all of this, but none of them have the whole package. And this is his special prophetic mission, to be a combiner. So syncretism, that combination of elements from all sorts of different religions, for him was a conscious mission. Take the best elements from everything. So his synthesis, what he called the religion of light, and the light image comes from Christianity, the light image comes from Judaism, the light image comes from Zoroastrianism, the light image comes from Gnosticism, was intended to reach the entire world. And in fact, he was revered as, in his own sect, as the final prophet, with the predecessors being, and the footsteps that he follows, allegedly are Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus. And he says in 242, on the coronation day of the Persian Shah, the King of Kings, the Persian Shah, Mani made his public declaration: as once Buddha came to India, Zoroaster to Persia, and Jesus to the lands of the West, so came in the present time this prophecy through me, the Mani, to the land of Babylonia. And so he really saw himself self-consciously as this new prophet, this new combinatorial prophet. Now, the spread of Manichaeanism was simply spectacular. In his own lifetime, Manichaeanism spread through the Aramaic portions of the world. So that's that little tight circle, the mid-3rd century circle, in Persia and Western Persia, and parts of India. Its success in the Roman world peaked in the next 2 centuries, where it briefly was a rival of Christianity in the Roman Empire. So you see the Roman and Byzantine Manichaean tradition has a heyday between the 3rd century and the 7th century, by which point it pretty much gets suppressed by a kind of triumphalist Christianity. St. Augustine himself, one of the great Latin fathers of the church, from Hippo in North Africa, Carthage, near Carthage, was a Manichaean for some years in the 4th century. And we learn about this through essays of his on Manichaeanism and through his autobiography, The Confessions. We find out about his Manichaean period. Mani incorporates Buddhist elements. He probably had direct access to Buddhists because he has a mission that he goes on to India, where he confronts both probably Confucianism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Buddhism. And all of these elements get incorporated into a theology that has its heyday in Asia in a later period. So you see that in the Abbasid, which is the Baghdad form of Islam that takes control of Islam after the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th century. In the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, Manichaeanism is still there and something to be expunged by the Islamic theologians. The Uyghurs are Manichaean until the 11th century, Northern Chinese until the 9th century, and Southeastern Chinese, there are remnants of Manichaeanism up until the 17th century. So It had a phenomenal success through the world as a little bit of everything. It is a dualism. It is a cosmic dualism. It teaches a dualistic worldview of good and evil, a powerful but not omnipotent good God, as opposed by an eternal evil power, a devil, but an opposing God, if you will. And an incredibly, as we will see, detailed and elaborate cosmology. He read his Gnostics very carefully, apparently. The conflict between the spiritual world of light and the material world of darkness is populated by a cast of characters that includes references and images from all the other major traditions. There isn't an angel mentioned in the Hebrew Bible that doesn't make an appearance. There isn't an emanation in the Gnostic universe that doesn't have a presence. There isn't a God in Zoroastrianism that doesn't make an appearance in the theology. So, a bit more about the cosmology, this light and darkness battle. Before the cosmos was created, so before creation, there were two beings, the Father of greatness and the King of darkness. When the King of dark, by the way, what I'm about to describe is such an oversimplification. There was no way, if I were going to take 20 slides, that I could elaborate all the scenes in the larger melodrama of the creation of the universe in Manichaean terms. When the King of darkness invades the realm of light, the Father of greatness, the God of light, adopts countermeasures. He's not omnipotent, but he puts up his defenses, which through a series of evocations, or what are termed in Manichaeanism as calls, led to the creation of the world. So the Father of greatness evoked from himself and a call, the mother of life, who in turn evoked the first or primal man. So it sounds a bit like the Gnostics. This constituted the first creation, of which there are going to be several. The first man and his sons, the five resplendent gods, air, wind, light, water, and fire, then went into battle against the king of evil and his five sons. The five sons of first man were then literally devoured by the five sons of darkness, with the result that a part of the light became imprisoned in the darkness. So light is imprisoned in this lower form. The first man pleads with the Father of greatness for the rescue of the light. This plea led to the creation of the friend of the lights, the great builder, and the living spirit. These are all separate emanationist entities. The mother of life and the living spirit together rescued the first man. The living spirit's call to the first man became the power that at the end of the world will gather the remaining light and arrange for it to be brought back to the realm of light. By the way, before I leave the slide, there's a seal with the head of Mani on it in the 3rd century, so he was a well-known figure. Now, I'll go through this diagram a bit. This diagram, by the way, is a Chinese silk screen from the 14th century that details, and we'll look at some of these elements in it in greater detail as we go along. But this is a representation of the entire Manichaean universe from the realm of light at the top through aeons and the liberation of light and firmaments of the sky and the earth, the 8 layers of earth, and the underworlds at the very bottom. Very elaborate, very detailed. But the universe as demiurges, so the living spirit and the mother of life are demiurges, these creative forces demiurge using the Platonic term, formed 8 layers of the world from the bodies of the slain demons, and 11 heavens from their skins, 10 spheres in the zodiac. Other demons were imprisoned in the world and the heavens, and the task of watching over and protecting the regions of the world was assigned to the 5 sons of the living spirit. The living spirit then revealed himself to the captured demons or archons. Remember the use of archons as creators of the physical world in Sethian Gnosticism, which caused them to emit some of the light that they had swallowed. Remember, they ate the sons of light. From a portion of this light, he made the ships of sun and moon. From the remainder of the light emitted by the archons, he created the wheels of wind, water, and fire, as well as other parts of the cosmic machine constructed for the deliverance of the still imprisoned light. Have to take a breath, huh? Now, on this diagram on the right, I say it, mentioned at the bottom of that box, paradise at the top, followed by the 2 circles of sun and moon, then 10 layers of heaven, 8 layers of earth, hell at the bottom. The mushroom-shaped mountain, Mount Meru, you see that little image about a quarter of the way up from the bottom, is where humans live. And Mount Meru is sacred in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist cosmologies. So everything gets mixed into the stew pot here. Now, this picture is a detail. I'll go back a step. See where those 2 circles are. This area about the quarter of the way down to a third of the way down is what I've blown into detail here. These are the Manichaean heavens. Imagery, as I characterize it here, run amok. With his espousal of knowledge and enlightenment, Mani claims the Gnostic mantle. He mocked Christianity, by the way, for its reliance on faith and mysteries, because his was a theory of knowledge, like the Gnostics. But the modern reader has to be astonished by the mind-bending and fanciful cosmology and the proliferation of eons, angels, light beings, demons, emanations, and tabernacles. By the way, there are listed in the Manichaean cosmology something towards 300 different characters who represent elements of angels and light beings and demons, etc. Adherents flocked to this, what I call dizzying operatic display, a universe of exotic minutiae narrated with a breathtaking lack of irony. Mani was quite straightforward, presented things straight out. There doesn't seem to be any irony whatsoever represented in his presentation. Now, salvation, let's try to see what this means for practical life on the planet. To set the light substance free from the darkness, which is the pollution of matter. You have the same soul-body split that you will in Gnosticism and Christianity, and frankly, and Buddhism for that matter. The light substance, to be free from the darkness, is to be freed from the pollution of matter. It's the ultimate aim of all Manichaean life. Humans are generally unaware of their sparks of light until they are awakened from their sleep by remembering their divine origin, or gnosis, straight out of Plato, if you will. God's victory is the regathering of light, which is based on righteous souls returning to paradise at death. So, we have a group of people who are the enlightened leaders, and he calls them the perfect or the elect. These are people, figures who entirely devoted themselves to the work of freeing the light. They led totally, utterly ascetic lives. Their lives look like the lives of Buddhist monks or Christian monks, for that matter. They were forbidden to own property, to eat meat, to drink wine, to gratify any sexual desire whatsoever, to work in any servile trade or in commerce, to use magic or to practice any other religion. The prohibition against sex, by the way, was intended as a prohibition against marriage and the bearing of children, because the propagation of the human race meant the continual imprisonment of light and matter. You have a baby, you've created another prison for some shards of light, being that little physical baby. So procreation was to be avoided when possible. The souls of people who persist in indulging the desires of the flesh are condemned to rebirth in a succession of bodies. So there's reincarnation. You'll keep on being reborn to the physical state and the realm of darkness until you are enlightened. You have the gnosis, and your light can escape back into and upwards into the realm of light. Now, everybody else, the folks who couldn't do this, of which, let's take a guess, 99%, were called the auditores, the hearers. The common believers who couldn't live like monks were the hearers. They were bound by Mani's 10 commandments against, the usual stuff: idolatry, lying, avarice, killing, fornication, theft, deceit, magic. In addition, they were obliged to prayer 4 times a day with ceremonial prostrations. This may have influenced Muhammad, some historians think, with the structured prayer and ceremonial prostrations on the little rugs at different times of the day. And fasting, they were to pay homage to the elect on bended knee, and they were to support them because the elect were sort of wanderers, and people had to bring them food, vegetables, of course, since they were vegetarian or vegan, for their maintenance. And here is a little visual of the elect in their white robes and their white hats, and the little guys, the auditores, who are going to bring them stuff to support them. So the perfecti and the auditores. We're going to see how the direct influence this group has on the Cathars and the Albigensians of the Middle Ages later on. They will come back. The Manichaeans will come back in a different format. Now, the role of Jesus in Manichaeanism and the visual, this is from that original diagram, that silkscreen that we looked at. This is another one of the details. It's the moon palace, the Virgin of Light, with Jesus the luminous and the first thought, the 3 figures. The Virgin of Light, Jesus the luminous, and the first thought. Jesus was the dominant historical predecessor for Mani, according to Mani. Despite the significance of Zoroaster in Persia, Mani's main contacts were with various Christian Gnostic sects, groups. By the way, when we talked about the Gnostics last week, and I settled on choosing as focal points just the Valentinians and the Sethians, there were dozens of others, major, the Elkasites, the Bardesanis, the Martianites. Martian was a major 1st century figure who had tremendous influence. We were limited in space and time, and I couldn't look at each of these separate manifestations. But Mani's contacts with Christians were from these Gnostic sects. And so Jesus is going to be presented via a kind of Gnostic version of Jesus. And in his first manifestation, it is as Jesus the luminous. His primary function was as supreme revealer and guide. A guide to what? To enlightenment. It is Jesus who wakes Adam from his slumber and reveals to him the divine origins of his soul and the soul's painful captivity because of its mixture with the darkness of a material body. Again, it's not salvation through um, the death and resurrection of Christ. It's salvation through his message of being called to understand the elements of godliness in yourself. Wake up to your own sparks of light. This aspect of Jesus is the Savior who redeems the light imprisoned in man. The redemptive intelligence, also called the great Noosa world soul, is an emanation in Manichaeism of Jesus the luminous. There is Jesus the child, according to Mani. This aspect, these are all aspects of the figure of Jesus as emanated. The aspect is an emanation of Jesus the luminous and is identified with the embodiment of the soul's will to redemption. So Jesus the child is the child within who wants this redemption. There's Jesus the moon. As Jesus the luminous has his cosmic seat on the moon, at least in popular belief, the moon itself is identified with Jesus the luminous. One text contains the phrase "at night when Jesus rose," meaning when the moon rose. There is Jesus the risen, or the eschatological Jesus, the Jesus of the last days, as prophesied to rule over humanity for 120 years after his final judgment and before the great conflagration purifies the remaining redeemable light. So in the end days, the Manichaean end days, there will be the final, Jesus will come, there will be the final judgment. He'll rule for 120 years, and then there will be the great burning away of any remnants of the material universe that still exists, and the light will be redeemed and will all return to the realm of light. There's Jesus the Messiah. This is Jesus as the historical prophet of the Jews. So this is Jesus as a Jew and a figure, a person, and the forerunner of Mani. So the last of the Jewish prophets and the predecessor to Mani as the ultimate prophet. Manichaeans believed that he was wholly divine and it did not accept the Christian doctrine of his having a body that was born and suffered. They abhorred the doctrine of a virgin birth and believed that Jesus as Messiah was only born at his baptism when, quote, quoting from the Gospel of Matthew, a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." So for the Manichaeans, that is the moment of Jesus's birth. When the soul is baptized, there was in this aside, the 7th century sect called the Docetists were a group that doubted the incarnation. In other words, they doubted that Christ took on the nature of a human body. In fact, they argued that Jesus only appeared to have a body. Remember, when we were talking about Christianity last week, I said one of the great topics over which Christian theologians battled for centuries was on the nature, what's called Christology, the nature of Christ. Is Christ God? Is Christ the man? Is Christ both? Does he have one nature? Does he have two natures? Does he have neither one or the other, spirit or body, but a third amalgam, a special kind of amalgam of some kind? All of these things, and the analogous topic of the nature once you try to define the nature of Christ, you're defining the nature of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What does that mean? Who are these figures? Are they all God? Does that mean there are three gods? Remember, the Muhammad accuses Christianity of being polytheists. Um, well, one of the voices in this discourse, and when I say one of the voices, I would say one of about 30 voices in this discourse, were the Docetists, who said, well, he was God and he was a spirit, and he didn't have a body. He just made it look that way. And Mani, with his uh, religion of light, picks right up on this. So the suffering, death, and resurrection of this Jesus were an appearance only, as they had no salvific value. There was no resurrection that saved people. There was no body to rise. But were an example, a kind of Momenschanz, a puppet play of suffering and deliverance from suffering of the human soul, and a prefiguration of Mani's own martyrdom. This painting on the upper right, again, is Chinese. It's a Manichaean painting of the Buddha Jesus. And we know it's the Buddha Jesus because if you look closely, there is a little crucifix, which we'll talk about in the next slide, held up in front of the Buddha Jesus. So another manifestation of Jesus is the suffering Jesus, the Jesus Patibilis. Cosmic light is imprisoned in matter. It is diffused throughout all nature. It is born, suffers, and dies every day. It is crucified on every tree. It is daily eaten in all food. Everything you see in the physical universe around you is a painful reminder of light that is suffering. The captive cosmic light is called Jesus Patibilis. It's light, which is suffering, and the suffering is palpable, not metaphorical, not because it is a body in pain, but because it is captured within a body waiting to be liberated. And of course, we have, as a comment on the suffering Jesus, the Mystica Crucifixio, or crucifixio in classical Latin, the cross, the mystical cross of light that the Buddha has. There's a closer picture of it. This constant and universal suffering, as expressed in the crucifixion on the cross of light, on which the suffering Jesus was suspended. The Mystica Crucifixio was present in every tree, herb, fruit, vegetable, stone, and clump of dirt. And I've excerpted from a Manichaean psalm. There are many Manichaean psalms to Jesus, as unlikely as we might find that. Come, my Lord Jesus, the Savior of souls, who has saved me from the drunkenness and error of the world by gnosis, by enlightening me. Thou art the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit. Christianity was called the Paraclete, whom I have loved since my youth. Thy light shines forth in me like the lamp of light. Thou hast driven away from me the oblivion of error. It's not faith, it's knowledge that's at stake here. Thou hast taught me to bless God and his lights. The light I have distinguished from the darkness, life from death. Christ and the church I have distinguished from the deceit of the world. I have known my soul and this body that lies upon it, that they are enemies to each other before the creations. The body of death and the soul are never in accord. The God of this aeon has shut the heart of the unbelieving and has sunk them in his error and the deceit of drunkenness. He has made them blaspheme against the God of truth and his power and his wisdom, Sophia. The Savior and his apostles and they that belong to the race of life revealed the darkness and the essence of the enemy. They wept for the body of death, the son of the great, this lion-faced dragon, and his mother also, matter. The light has shone forth for you, O you that sleep in hell, the knowledge of the Paraclete, the ray of light. Drink of the water of memory. Remember the light within. Cast away oblivion. He that is wounded and desires healing, let him come to the physician. A Manichaean psalm to Jesus. So let us move on to Hermeticism as the other one of the topics. Everything we're doing, talking about today, is all lodged in the 3rd century, the 200s. A period in the Roman Empire, for instance, when syncretism was at its height because chaos was at its height. A little background Roman history. I don't want to dwell on this because we're not doing Roman history as such. But after a glory period in the 2nd century, the 100s, under the Antonine emperors, a kind of a golden age of the world, the 3rd century saw 45 emperors in 50 years. The empire it was just armies moving everywhere. There was chaos, there were rebellions. And of course, there was a lot of population movement and a lot of the kind of ghost dance religious impulse that you find when the world physically falls apart or politically falls apart. People turn to religions and magical solutions, and religious leaders often have their heyday, as was the ghost dance for Plains Indians in the 19th century. So we have this figure in the 3rd century, the same period as Mani, the same period as the rise of, as we will see, of Neoplatonism, the same period as one of the first great consolidations of Christianity. And this figure is Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes, the thrice great, a legendary figure that originated as a Hellenistic syncretic combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. Hermes had several associations in Greek mythology as a herald, the messenger, the great expediter of the Olympians, but his earliest manifestations were as a god of magic and shamanism, a guide to the world of secret knowledge. He was basically a sort of the fix-it god, the god with secret solutions to everything that you needed when you needed it. And Thoth, the Egyptian Hermes, if you will, in his depictions, he is the god of magic and knowledge, easily identified with Hermes by Hellenistic Greeks looking for syncretic overlaps. So when the Ptolemies come to Egypt after Alexander, they see Thoth and immediately strikes them as just an Egyptian version of a god that they knew well. So here's Hermes, and I've mislabeled this picture. It should be, the name should be Thoth, and I'll correct that before I send it out. And there is a picture of Hermes Trismegistus, this legendary figure, which is a floor tile in the Duomo of Siena. Because, as we will see during the Renaissance, as they're rediscovering these documents, they actually think he's more than a legendary figure. They actually think that he was the source of a great wisdom tradition that was a predecessor to the Pythagoreans and all of Greek philosophy, and a, if you will, an ancestor of Plato. not literally, but an intellectual ancestor of Plato. So they thought. So the Hermetica, this is an assembly of ancient texts that existed in the 3rd century. We come across them usually in Greek, but we find them in forms of Coptic, Egyptian Coptic. There's a group of texts. The modern historians tend to group them 2 ways. There are the technical texts, the technical Hermetica, and these were written in Greek, and they were on what they would have called real science, real how-to, practical instructions, astrology, medicine, alchemy, magic, and that from 200 BC to 300, and the Common Era, so for 500 years, there were studies, astrological, alchemical studies, written by Romans, written by Egyptians, written by Syrians, who would have claimed that they first heard of this principle from an account that they can attribute to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus. Then there is this very interesting, what historians try to call the religio-philosophical Hermetica. And these are a relatively coherent set of texts that espouse a quasi-religious philosophy of rebirth, the way of Hermes, and the relationship of humans, the cosmos, and God. And these all came from the modern period. By modern, I mean 100 to 300 Common Era, AD. So at the same time that Manichaeism, Christianity, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism were all taking form, so there is the philosophical Hermetica, putting in its 2 cents of the same thing, of the same kinds of thinking. Now, the legend of Hermes, and who will be called, by the way, Mercury or Mercutius by the Romans. So you'll find references to Mercutius Trismegistus. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, the legend began that Hermes was an historical pagan prophet who foresaw the coming of Jesus and Christianity. This is attested by various Manichaean and Christian sources, including Mani himself and St. Augustine. Since, as was the case with Gnosticism, some Hermetic ideas mirror orthodoxy, the Hermetica received a sympathetic ear in some circles. One Christian theologian said, he makes many statements agreeable to the truth concerning the one true God. The caduceus is always the symbol, by the way, of Hermes. Platonism, in one narrative, Hermes was a classical Greek forerunner of Pythagoras, whose followers adopted Greek ideas of the immortality of the soul and further embellished them with the Platonic concept of the good. So the Platonists are saying, yes, this Hermes was a predecessor. And this is a tradition that will receive great adherence in the Renaissance. The humanists of the Renaissance will talk about a prisca theologia. So another narrative, a narrative that was popular right up through the Renaissance, was that God gave Hermes a single true prisca theologia, ancient theology, that threads through all religions. This is why Mani liked the idea, that there was this, if you will, this burnished, pure, silver version of a true theology, elements of which wind up spilling into different religious traditions. And this version, Hermes Trismegistus, was a contemporary of Moses, whose ancestry included Enoch and Noah. The revelation then passed through a series of prophets, including Zoroaster and Plato, whose religions and philosophies were seen as derivations or corruptions of the core tenets. So the definitions of Hermes Trismegistus to Asclepius, written a long dialogue, is the most important treatise in the Hermetica, since it contains a kind of a superset of these religious ideas that you get through all the treatises. The way of Hermes, a god from which, central theme, a god from which everything emanates. Now, this idea, as we will see, we're one step ahead of ourselves here, but this idea is reminiscent of Neoplatonism, which posits a single source, the one, or the good, from which all existence flows. In Hermeticism, this source is often referred to as the all or the one thing, and it is both inherent in all being and transcendent, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's at once a kind of pantheist view, everything contains it somehow, but it transcends everything simultaneously. It's beyond everything simultaneously. So this quote from the Corpus Hermeticum: mind, hear my son, how stands God in all? God, aeon, cosmos, time, becoming. God makes aeon, aeon makes cosmos, cosmos makes time, time makes becoming. The good, the beautiful, wisdom, blessedness is the essence of God. Of aeon, the essence is sameness. Of cosmos, the essence is order. Of time, the essence is change. Of becoming, the essence is life and death. The body-mind split is upon us again. So there is a gnosis, a knowledge, is the awakening or rebirth. The body must be transcended. So strong Gnostic overtones. From the Corpus Hermeticum again. Seek for one to take you by the hand and lead you into Gnosis's gates, where shines clear light of every darkness clean. But first thou must tear off the cloak which you wear, the web of ignorance, the ground of bad, corruption's chain, the carapace of darkness, the living death, sensation's corpse, the tomb you carry with you, which is what? Your body. You must tear it off. Tear away the body. And there is this profoundly influential, yet again, theory of macrocosm and microcosm, elements in the individual human that reflect forces and elements in the universe, and vice versa. Everything is connected. If you understand the big picture, you understand yourself. If you understand the person and the soul, you understand the universe. So the technical Hermetica, as the leading source for astrological and alchemical treatises, these share the central and historically important theory of macrocosm, microcosm, the analogy for describing the unity of the physical world. And we have a thing called the Emerald Tablet, also called the Smaragdine Table. This tablet, it's an artifact, is cited as the clearest expression of the principle at the heart of the alchemical tradition that flourished until the late European Renaissance, which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks when we start talking about the Renaissance in the last session. 'Tis true, without lying, certain and most true, that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to do the miracle of one only thing. This is quoted all over the Renaissance. And as all things have been and arose from one by the mediation of one, so all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation. The sun is its father, The moon its mother, the wind hath carried it in its belly, the earth is its nurse, the father of all perfection, and the whole world is here. Its force or power is entire if it be converted into earth. Separate thou the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, sweetly with great industry. It ascends from the earth to the heaven, and again it descends to the earth and receives the force of things superior and inferior. By this means you shall have the glory of the whole world, and thereby all obscurity shall fly from you. Its force is above all force, for vanquishes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. So was the world created. And we have this image of an Egyptian alchemist transmuting things into precious metals. Hence, I am called Hermes Trismegistus, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. That which I have said of the operation of the sun is accomplished and ended. Moving on again. Again, we're going to stay in the 3rd century. So I'm not going to spend much time with Plato proper. We've talked about him a bit. Any of you that have sat through like the Greek class with me, or any class that had anything to do with philosophy at all, knows that what the general outlines of Plato look like. I recapitulated a little bit here from the 5th century BC to the present. The theories of Plato, the Athenian, have in their many iterations been central to the project of Western philosophy. His theory of forms posited a realm of real ideas, abstract objects, the essences of things that exist distinct from both the sensible world of things and from the conscious mind. So if you have an idea like number, the number 2, if you have an idea like horse, the essence of those beings in the world that are mere copies of the idea horse, you understand that there is this realm of things that you can intuit, and that's the source of all language and all thought and all logic. So a period of Middle Platonism. Plato dies in the middle of the 4th century BCE. And so, I don't know, 350-ish or so. From that point all the way to the 3rd century Common Era, so 500 to 600 years, that period is characterized by so-called Middle Platonism. And usually Middle Platonism is a Hellenistic enterprise. And it sets up the task of trying to reconcile Plato with Aristotle and with the Stoics, Zeno the Stoic. So what are the central truths shared by all three of these giants became the focal point of Middle Platonism. By the 1st century, however, the mystical tendencies of Hellenistic Judaism, Christianity, Gnosticism, and Manichaeanism instigated a rereading of Plato. So thinkers like the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lives into the mid-1st century Common Era, and the pagan Plutarch, who's lives into the 2nd century of the Common Era, they restore a religious dimension of Platonism with a focus on, Plato's good, what Plato called the good, this idea of a transcendent God, and Plato's idea of the immortality of the soul. So they suddenly start switching the focus back, because now they're lodged in a world of these new religions, all of which have a mystical bent. They recalibrate the focus back onto that Plato. And out of this is born in the 3rd century the grand tradition of so-called Neoplatonism. Now, in the 3rd century, the religious traditions of the empire were building highly evolved rational theologies. So these mystical efforts were suddenly coming under the scrutiny of rational theological attempts to explain them. Thus, you have the heated debates between pagans and Christians and between different camps of Christians over what's orthodoxy and what the nature of Christ is. People are applying philosophical analysis to the mysticism, saying, so what is the nature of Christ? And now they're involved in long theological discourses. People like Augustine and Jerome and Athanasius and Origen of Alexandria. I mean, there are dozens of these people. Neoplatonism was developed incorporating the mystical elements of Platonism with the rigorous analytics of this current environment. So it was soon recognized by Christian theologians, the earliest, Justin Martyr, the end of the first century, and Athenagoras of Alexandria, as providing a sympathetic philosophical structure for underpinning Christian theology. In other words, this emerging form of systematic Neoplatonism, which we're going to take a look at in a moment, a number of early Christian theologians say, this isn't bad. If we need an approach underpinning Christian theology, this Neoplatonism points in a lot of directions that we are interested in. In the 4th century, the great church father Augustine built an entire theology out of Neoplatonism that would dominate Christian thought for the next 1,000 years until sort of the rehabilitation of Aristotle by Aquinas and some of the scholastic philosophers at the University of Paris. But Augustine is going to be there for 8 to 10 centuries as the dominant influence in Christian theology. And he's going to sound a lot like a pure Neoplatonist. Well, let's see what it's about. The inventor of the tradition was a Hellenized, of course, Egyptian, Plotinus, who lives entirely in the 3rd century. His student from Syria, the Phoenician Porphyry, whose life, he's a generation or so younger, but his life is pretty much encapsulated in the 3rd century. And Porphyry's student, the other Syrian, Iamblichus, also, these two were also major contributors to the school. There's also a figure called Pseudo-Dionysius. But Plotinus, we're going to look at as the core figure. Note that it's still the Eastern Roman Empire that produces this cultural elite. And why is it the Eastern Roman Empire in this period? Because even though urban life has moved into the West just as well, Greek was still the curriculum of choice and the intellectual language that dominated these discourses in the Eastern Mediterranean, thanks to the successors of Alexander the Great and the Hellenism that was spread throughout Western Persia and all the way through the Eastern Mediterranean. So Greek and Greek thought were still going to be the backbone of Christian theology, of Manichaeanism in the Mediterranean, of Gnosticism, obviously, and of Judaism in the first couple of centuries of the Common Era. Plotinus, we have a Roman sarcophagus that has Plotinus. It's thought to be a representation of Plotinus and his students. He studied the entire Greek philosophical tradition. He knew it forwards and backwards, particularly Plato and Aristotle. He was most sympathetic to the Platonic distrust of the sensory world. and was attracted most to Plato, much more than he would have been to Aristotle, and chose to apprentice himself to a Platonist named Ammonius Saccas. In his late 30s, he was known to have traveled to the East where, like Mani, he may have been exposed to the influence of Persian and Indian philosophers, which will be interesting because we see parallels between certain Buddhist principles and certain Neoplatonic principles. His writings, published by Porphyry, are called the Enneads, 6 groups of 9 treatises each. They are at once closely argued and mystical, and not surprisingly, as I pointed out, attractive to Christian philosophers. The central idea is the one. In Greek, I showed you this in Greek, the tohen, the en in Greek has a rough breathing mark in front of it, so it would have been pronounced hen, the tohen, the one. It's going to sound a lot like the Matrix before we're done with it. The core of his thought is that the mystery Plato calls the good and Plotinus calls the one is infinite, invisible, and utterly transcendent beyond all categories of being and non-being. You can't even say that the one is being in itself. Indeed, it is beyond any conceptualization. It cannot be known. As Aquinas said about God, we can only speak about what it is not. What we can speak of, being, non-being, intellection, ideas, number, physical objects, exist in dependence on the one. They are not created. Rather, they emanate. The one is a simple unity. So quoting from Ennead 5, standing before all things, there must exist a simplex. What does modern physics call it? A singularity. A simplex differing from all its sequel, self-gathered, not interblended with the forms that rise from it. All the forms, all those ideas, etc., the Platonic forms, it's not interblended with them. They rise from it, and yet able in some mode of its own to be present to those others. Untouched by multiplicity, it's absolutely simple. It will be wholly self-sufficing and absolute first, whereas any not first demands it's earlier. It's not first, it's got to be something before it. And any non-simplex needs the simplicities within itself as the very foundations of its composite existence. So it's got to be a simplex, it's got to be transcendent. The one is transcendent, it's beyond being. The one is all things and no one of them. The source of all things is not all things. All things are its possession, running back, so to speak, to it. Or more correctly, not yet so. They will be. But a universe from an unbroken unity in which there appears no diversity, not even duality, it is precisely because that is nothing within the one that all things are from it. In order that being may be brought about, the source must be no being, but beings generated, and what is to be thought of as a primal act of generation. All from his own quotes. The one is not a self-aware creator God. The good has no scope whatever for intellection, which demands something. So instead of the God of the Old Testament, this creator God, the God who's anthropomorphized, he's saying, well, we can't have a God like that because in the very act of intellection, there has to be an object known. So the good has no scope, whatever for intellection, which demands something from outside. The good then is without act. It's pure, it can't act, it can't, it's pure potency. There is, we report duality in any thinking being, and the first is wholly above the dual. So act entails change, which is not possible for the first principle, which is pure potency. And intellection entails something known, that is, a duality, which is not possible. I don't know whether you're getting the sense yet. I'm going to drive towards it, but how attractive this is going to be to early Christian theologians of the second and third and fourth centuries, who are suddenly being given a language to talk about this great mystery of God that is not simply the anthropomorphized Old Testament God, but is now this creative principle of the Trinity. Whence does the world come from? Therefore, the philosophical problem becomes one of explaining how the world comes to be. In other cosmologies, you have, creator gods or demiurges. They make things with their anthropomorphized hands and brains and wills. But here he has said, this is a God that's beyond being, that is not conscious in what we take consciousness to be, that is not intelligence in that sense. How does the world come to be? The mind demands the existence of these beings, but it is still in trouble over the problem endlessly debated by the ancient philosophers. From such a unity as we have declared the one to be, how does anything at all come into substantial existence? Any multiplicity, dyad, or number? Where the hell does it come from? It comes from emanation. Plotinus explains the existence of everything: intellect, the world soul, ideas, individual souls, physical things, as a series of emanations from the one which in itself is unaltered. Using technical language developed by Plato and Aristotle and the Hellenistic successor philosophical disciplines, he argues that existences by their essence, all these technical terms, have a power, an outward-facing hypostasis, an outward-facing reality that generates effects. And he can only speak of it metaphorically. He says this exists, but like Plato, I have to resort to metaphor to describe it because it's incomprehensible. It must be, I like the way he phrases that, it has to be a circumradiation produced from the supreme, so a radiation in every direction, but from the supreme unaltering, and may be compared to the brilliant light encircling the sun and ceaselessly generated from that unchanging substance. All existences, as long as they retain their character, produce about themselves from their essence, from what they are, in virtue of the power which must be in them, some necessary outward-facing hypostasis, continuously attached to them and representing in image the engendering archetypes. So what does light results in images of the engendered archetypes. Thus, fire gives out its heat. Snow is cold, not merely to itself. Fragrant substances are a notable instance, for as long as they last, something is diffused from them and perceived wherever they are present. It's an emanation. Emanation and return. So all things desire the good. Plato made, as you know, if you read Republic or any of them, quite a thing. The soul tends upward. The height in Republic, he makes it clear that the desire for knowledge is at its root the highest forms of eroticism. It's the eroticism of the soul for the good and the pure. Everything desires the good for Plato. The soul tends upwards. The intellectual principle, says Plotinus, in us must mount to its origins. It must deliver itself over to those powers within it which tend upward. The soul desires beauty, the intellectual principle, seeking the beautiful, the most beautiful of all, lying lapped in pure light and in clear radiance, circumscribing the nature of the authentic existence, the original of which this beautiful world is a shadow and an image, tranquil in the fullness of a living thing and a life of blessedness. This too must overwhelm with awe any that has seen it. As one that looks up to the heavens and sees the splendor of the stars, thinks of the Maker and searches, so whoever has contemplated the intellectual universe and known it and wondered for it must search after its Maker too. What being has raised so noble a fabric, and where, and how? Who has begotten such a child, this intellectual principle, this lovely abundance, so abundantly endowed? And so this diagram of the Tohen, the one, has emanated intellect, both the world soul and individual souls, ultimately, and the world of matter through the demiurge, the world soul's demiurge, into the sensible world, the physical world of artifacts. And the path to knowledge is the individual soul connecting through the realm of the forms. This intellect is the realm of the forms. So as you know things, as you move from the percepted objects in the world to the concepted ideas that they emulate, you are returning up the tree, up the emanation path, except not downwards now. Your mind, in its erotic desire to know and understand, is returning upwards. And he's going to tell us this individual soul can desire to return to the one, but it can't do it intellectually because the one is beyond intellect. It's beyond understanding. It's not knowable, but the desire is to the return to the source. And so, and again, the Christians love him for this. He speaks of henosis, the oneing, the mystical union, the hypostatic union, which all of Christian, and for that matter, Jewish and Kabbalistic mysticism, and probably every other form of Buddhist mysticism, this return to that which can't be conceptualized as a mystical union. The soul's desire upwards towards the one beauty good is beyond the scope of intellect because the one is beyond conceptualization. There is, however, the possibility of mystical union with the one, henosis, literally the oneing, which Plotinus describes and which Porphyry tells us Plotinus achieved on 4 different occasions. So much the way that the little flowers of St. Francis, his fellow travelers, describe Francis receiving the stigmata and having mystical experiences on a number of different occasions. And Christian mystics, Teresa of, we'll talk about this in the last session, Teresa of Avila in the throes of her mystical union. Plotinus describes exactly this, much the way bodhisattvas describe achieving nirvana. Withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue that is to be made beautiful. He cuts away here. He smooths there. He makes this line lighter, this other purer, until a lovely face is grown upon his work. So do you also. Cut away. When you know that you have become this perfect work, when you are self-gathered in the purity of your being, nothing now remaining that can shatter that inner unity, nothing from without clinging to the authentic man. When you find yourself wholly true to your essential nature, wholly that only veritable light which is not measured by space, not narrowed to any circumscribed form, nor again diffused as a thing void of term, but ever unmeasurable as something greater than all measure and more than all quantity. When you perceive that you have grown to this, you are now become very vision. Now call up all your confidence, strike forward yet a step. You need a guide no longer. Strain and see. What is beyond the intellectual principle, we affirm to be the nature of good radiating beauty before it, so that treating the intellectual cosmos as one, the first is the beautiful. If we make distinction there, the realm of ideas constitutes the beauty of the intellectual sphere, and the good which lies beyond is the fountain at once and the principle of beauty. The primal good and the primal beauty have the one dwelling place, and thus always beauty's seat is there. As the Christian mystics say, first empty yourself, of yourself. Now, our last slide, and then we'll chat a bit. The appeal of Neoplatonism to Christianity is, it just goes off in every direction. Christianity needed a philosophical language for the expression of these theological ideas, it turned to Platonism. After nearly 3 centuries of this project, the culmination was Augustine of Hippo. Surface similarities are obvious. The first principle, God, is an infinite, unknowable unity and source of all beauty and good. The superiority of the spiritual to the material, the immortality of the soul, the innate seeds of the ideas, the forms, born into the soul, are the seminal reasons that Augustine talks about. In fact, Augustine says the idea you're born with the seed to knowing God. And grace is what allows you to, the only reason it's not sensible to you instantly from birth on is because of the fall of Adam and our darkened souls, but grace, the grace of Christ and faith, and shines the light on what you already know, as a Platonist would have indicated it. The innate urge to desire God or beauty or truth. But beyond these, the sense of moral purpose, powered by what Plato described as the highest form of erotic desire, is key to the appeal to Christianity. For Augustine, only the theory of emanation need be discarded as a nice attempt, well done Plotinus, by a well-disposed philosophical sensibility that was pagan, that did not have the benefit of Christian revelation. This is what Augustine will tell us. Plotinus could have been a perfect Christian, a little bit of grace, and he wouldn't have needed the emanation theory. He would have bought into the Old Testament and as something allegorical that needed to be understood mystically, but he would have bought into it as an act of creation. Some of the theologians of this, Christian theologians of this period, used to even refer to Socrates, the character in all of Plato's dialogues, as Saint Socrates, as they would have called him. When Augustine died, as the Vandals, Augustine dies in the early 5th century, the Vandals have invaded the empire. They've come through Spain. They settle in Spain for a while. The Visigoths basically settle in Spain. But the Vandals make it to North Africa. They besiege Hippo. And an ancient biographer tells us that at this moment, Augustine quoted Plotinus. And what does he quote? How can he, the sage, take any great account of the vacillations of power or the ruin of his fatherland? Certainly, if he thought any such event a great disaster, or any disaster at all, he must be of a very strange way of thinking. One that sets great store by wood and stones, or by mortality among mortals, cannot yet be the sage, whose estimate of death we hold must be that it is better than life in the body. So why should I be afraid of what happens here in the world? Uh, does he quote any of his saintly Christian predecessors? No. He quotes the sage Plotinus. Anyhow, that is it. I will stop the share. I will remove the pin. Questions, observations?
Question for you. Did the Manichaeans leave any kind of canonical theological document, Book of Mormon,
Not,
or
yeah, they did. Not single, but there are lots of bits and pieces of writings of Mani himself, or attributed to Mani himself, and but they are filled again with these wildly imaginative. You know, if you've ever read the Hebrew Old Testament closely, there are references to scores of angels. There are a lot of named figures which we take as, um, so much um, flowery completion of the essential story uh, that in the ancient world were taken as real entities. Every angel was considered important. You still see this among Hasidim, for instance, where angels with specific names have identities and things like that. Anyhow, so next week we look at the Middle Ages a bit, and the week after that we'll look at the Renaissance. A lot of the ideas that we've been looking at in these underground uh, modes of thinking and traditions are going to persist. And we're going to see elements of them. I can't do them all justice. I can't take us right up through the Rosicrucians and what modern Hasidism does, for instance. But I'll take us through a couple of elements. It'll be of interest. Anyhow,
Thanks, Lou.